What what I want to talk about this morning is a first example of what we've been identifying as conceptual onomasiological variation. That is to say, differences of categorization, differences of categorical construal of the world. And what I specifically want to address today, perhaps first a bit of reference to the background of this talk. The materials that I'm presenting today can be found in one of the chapters in a book I published in 2006, Words and Other Wonders, and it's chapter 9 in that book. But the questions I want to address have to do with cultural variation and historical variation in categorization, and specifically in this case the categorization of emotions. So I want to talk about a very well-known metaphor in cognitive linguistics, namely the anger is the heat of a fluid in a container metaphor that you probably know from George Lakoff's and Zoltan Kovacic's work on anger. It's a prime example of conceptual metaphor theory. But what I want to show is that in this case, this particular type of categorizing the emotion of anger, because if you say anger is the heat of a fluid of a container, you're metaphorically categorizing anger. I would like to show to you that this type of metaphorical categorization has probably, at least to some extent, a culturally specific background and a historically specific background. That's an interesting point because in the discussion on this type of metaphor, you often get the statement or sometimes the implication that it's a universal metaphor and that there is a physiological basis to it, that it is a metaphor that is based on a feeling of getting hot when you are angry. And that is the motivation for having this type of metaphorical construal. By contrast, I would want to go into the specific historical background of this metaphor. And so, the overall line of argumentation in the context of the talks as a whole is that when you have this type of, when you can establish this type of historical background for this well-known metaphor, then we can certainly see that there is something socio-culturally and historically specific to categorization. So how will I go about this? Well, I would like to show that in this metaphor, in the development of the anger is the heat of fluid in a container metaphor, you get a process that I will identify as deliteralization. What I would like to show is that the metaphor originally was not a metaphor. Originally, it was meant as, for that time, for the period in which it evolved, a historically literal metaphor, a scientifically correct metaphor, given the scientific background of the time. And what I mean by deliteralization, that's in itself, the term is not so important, is the fact that sometimes categories, classificatory categories, may lose their motivation. So when we think of metaphor, we usually think that metaphor is a process where you are trying to name something that you don't know yet. And then you look for a model that is more familiar to you, and you use that model to name the new thing, or to name the unexpected thing, or to name a thing that you already know in an unexpected way. That's how we think of metaphor. In this case, I think we have a different source for the metaphor. The source is that at one point in time, people lost track of what was originally a literal scientific motivation for the categorization. So that's a different source of metaphor than what we usually think. And specifically, again, I want to repeat this because it's important, specifically it's a metaphor, or it's a process of metaphorization that shows you that there is something socio-culturally and historically specific to these processes. Just to give you another example of what can go on when you lose an originally literal motivation, I can give you the Dutch word walvis, which is the same as whale in English. But in walvis, you have the component part vis, which is like fish. So literally, walvis is whale fish. Now, in the medieval period, if you look at the texts of those times, you can see that whales were actually considered to be fishes. Now, we no longer consider whales to be fishes. We know that they're mammals. But still, the fish part is there in the name, which means that we are now reinterpreting the fish part in the name. So in the, if fish makes sense in this name at all, in walvis, if the fish part of the component makes sense at all, it is through a process of deliteralization, something that was originally a literal denomination, a literal categorization, has lost its motivation because our scientific insights have changed and is now being interpreted metaphorically or at least figuratively. And so I would like to show that something similar is going on in these emotion metaphors. Yes, so if we indeed have that process of deliteralization, then we do find something very interesting for processes of categorization, because as I already said, categorization, or at least metaphorical categorization, is then not just finding an approximating model for something that we do not understand very well, but also finding an appropriate interpretation for a category whose motivation has become unclear. Which would mean that we could distinguish between two types of metaphorical thinking. Metaphorical thinking where you try to make sense of the world, which is the primary way we think of metaphor. But it could also be metaphors that arise from trying to make sense of the language, like saying you have this fish part in the name walvis, whalefish. What can it mean, given that we don't know that we do know that whales are not fishes? So then, what is that fish thing? And then you start thinking of new interpretations as a way of making sense of the language, rather than making sense of the world. So, thank you. The specific focus of the talk will now be on the word emotion. If you think of emotions, and if you think of the category emotion, why are emotions called emotions? And what is the motion part in emotion? Is there a link between emotion and motion as in movement? If we think about the motivation for the term emotion at all, it's probably in terms of something like internal movement. An emotion is something that upsets the equilibrium of your mind or your soul. Emotions are an internal turmoil, something like that. So if that is the case, well, maybe most of the time we don't even think of the background, the motivational background of the term emotion. But if we do at all, in what way would we do it? Well, if you ask people, they usually come up with this kind of explanation. Emotions are called emotions because there is this link with motion in the soul or in the mind, let's say in the soul, as an internal turmoil. So the question then is, against the background of what I've just explained, is that an original metaphorical link, or is it rather a metaphorical link that results from a deliteralizing interpretation, a reinterpretation? And I'll try to show that the latter is the case, that the word emotion itself, like, if you wish, Volvis, in my example a moment ago, that emotion, to the extent that we link it with a figurative reading of motion, that emotion is the result, or that interpretation of the word emotion is the result of a deliteralizing process. I have to take quite a number of steps to show this to you, and I'll first have to give you a bit of background. Then I'll say something about the research strategy that we are using here. Then I have to do two things. I have to first give you a semasiological analysis of the verb émouvoir in Old French. Why? Well, emotion in English is a loan from French. And emotion as a noun derives from emotion, French term émotion, derives from the French verb émouvoir. Émouvoir is, well, no, we'll see later what it means. So if we want to know something about the history of emotion, about the historical origin of emotion, we'll have to go and have a look at the Old French verb émouvoir first. So that's what we'll do. We'll go through a number of quotations of the Old French verb on a semasiological basis, and then the next step will be that we compare the verb émouvoir with the verb mouvoir. That's the more onomasiological analysis. Why do we want to do that? Well, if you take the French verb émouvoir, it's a compound, or at least it's a composite term, and it's composed of another verb, mouvoir, which means to move. Right? So émouvoir in Old French is like, it has the same, the relation between émouvoir and mouvoir is the same as that between emotion and motion. And there's some Latin background here too, but we'll come to that in a moment. So we're going to have a fairly close look at some quotations from Old French and Middle French and so on. And then we'll come to conclusions. The background here, but I don't want to explain too much about that, is that we have a number of tendencies, a number of fields of research in diachronic semantics within cognitive linguistics. Basically, there are three lines of research if you look at what people do in diachronic cognitive linguistics. You have prototype research. We've already talked about that. You've seen examples. There is a very strong tendency to look for regularities of semantic change. That's a line of research that links up very, very closely with grammaticalization research. And then there is also a trend of historical metaphor research. And that has so far not been very popular, but you can see that in just the last few years there is more and more of this historical metaphor research. So what I'm presenting is situated in that direction. Now, in terms of background, as one of the first steps to take, there is this question which I already hinted at a few minutes ago about the universality of the embodiment of metaphors, because it's one of the claims of number of claims or maybe suggestions of some people in cognitive linguistics that embodiment is a universal phenomenon. Well, that's probably uncontroversial, but that specifically embodiment in as illustrated by this metaphorical pattern, anger is the heat of a fluid in a container, is also a universal thing. And it is a universal thing, that's the reasoning. It is a universal thing precisely because, because it has a physiological basis. Now, in an article that I published together with Stefan Grondelaars, well, already many years ago, an article called Looking Back at Anger, we tried to show that the anger is the heat of a fluid in a container metaphor is not a universal, physiologically motivated conceptualization, but a culturally specific one. And specifically, that it reflects the historical importance of what is known in the history of science and the history of medicine as the theory of humours. Now, let's first, but this is something that you may be familiar with, let's first have a look at some of the evidence that is invoked to posit this metaphorical pattern that anger is the heat, etc. So the metaphors, the metaphorical expressions that people refer to when they postulate that patterns are things like these. I had reached a boiling point, she was seething with rage, he lost his cool, you make my blood boil, etc. You probably know these. So that led Covicius and Lakoff to posit this pattern. Anger is the heat of a fluid or container, and more generally, anger is fire. With the idea that there's a bit of a physiological background. Now, I could do two things at this point. I could already ask you from your cultural background how universal this metaphor could be for you. If you think of Chinese culture, to what extent is anger related to fire? It could be, but it's also the case that, at least that's what I read, and you can discuss that. I've also read that there is an association between fire and certainly also the color red with liveliness and festivity and joy, perhaps even. But that's for you to decide or to investigate. I will be coming back briefly to that when we have a more full view of what the theory of humours is. So that's one thing I could do. We could start making cultural comparisons straight away. But I want to go through the history or through some aspects of Western history first here, and have a look at some anger expressions that we find in Shakespeare. And this is a quotation from The Taming of the Shrew, right? This Shakespeare play, where you get this character who is really easily irritated and easily angered. And this is how she describes herself, and you will notice that you get a lot of expressions that superficially seem to fit in with the anger is heat metaphor. But there are some other aspects to the quotations that will lead us to a slightly different type of interpretation. Were I not a little pot and soon hot. Okay, I'm this thing, this kettle or whatever that is being heated. I'm easily angered. Is she so hot a shrew? I tell thee, Kate, 'twas burned and dried away, and I expressly am forbid to touch it, for it engenders choler, planteth anger, and better it were that both of us did fast, since of ourselves are choleric. Okay, well, this already introduces something new. Because what you get here is a reference to food. What it says is, I'm telling you, Kate, this type of food, we should not eat it. We shouldn't eat it because it makes us angry. It planted anger. It makes us angry. Why? Well, it engenders choler. It engenders choler. What is choler? And of ourselves, we are already choleric. What does that mean? What you have here is a physiological thing. Choler refers to what in the medical theories of that time is considered as one of the basic fluids in the human body. And people who are choleric, and we still know the word choleric at this point, people who are choleric, those are the people who are easily angered. But why are they easily angered? Because their physiological equilibrium is not optimal. They produce too much choler. And if they eat certain types of food, their choler will rise even more. Think about that for a moment. In the first part of this first quotation that I have, were I not a little potential hot, that's something that you can place straightforwardly in the anger is the heat, etc. metaphor. But then if you look at some of the other quotations or the other expressions that Shakespeare uses to refer to this anger feeling, you see that there is another background. There is a physiological theory behind his conception of anger. There's a physiological theory which has to do with fluids in the body and specifically an overproduction of choler. I'm not going to go through the other parts, the other quotations from the play, but let's try to move to a more generic point here. So it seems that the Shakespearean expressions fit the anger is the heat of the fluids in a container metaphor, but at the same time, the origin of the metaphor would seem to be cultural rather than physiological, or cultural in the sense of scientific even, medicinal. At least in Shakespeare, we find that the influence of the humoral theory is well established. Now, what is that humoral theory? Well, it's a medical theory that was first formulated by Hippocrates in the 5th century BC, and it consists of a combination of a physiological and a psychological theory. Physiological theory in the sense that the workings of the body are conceived of in terms of 4 basic fluids, the humours, and the psychology of human beings is related to that physiolocal theory in the way in which we saw already. Right? So anger is related with the fluid choler, and an overproduction of choler produces anger. In Western culture, this is then further developed by Aristotle, who adds a cosmological background, a microcosmos, macrocosmos correspondence, and Galen in the 2nd century then adds a dietary pharmacology, that is to say, you classify the types of food that you can eat in terms of what they do to the 4 humours. So if you are a choleric type of person, if you have a choleric temperament, then of course you should avoid those kinds of foodstuffs that overproduce or that make you overproduce choler. You will notice that there is a lot in here that links up with aspects that, at least to my knowledge, with aspects that you also find in Chinese cultural history. The idea of equilibrium in the body is well known in this culture. The idea of a relationship between what you eat and what it does to your body and probably also to your temperament, to your mental equilibrium is well known in this culture. So there is a relationship. On the other hand, and that's probably becoming clearer in a moment, the elements, the basic elements that you refer to, or that they refer to in the theory of humors, would seem to be somewhat different from what you get in the Chinese, well, I can't say the Chinese version, but in the Chinese counterpart of this kind of approach. But that's for in a moment. At this point, I also want to say that the humoral theory was extremely long-lived in Western history and in the history of Western medicine. And it actually disappeared only very gradually after the Renaissance. Basically, it just appeared in the 19th century. If you think of a practice like bloodletting, for instance, it's typically related to the theory of humors. So when people were ill, what doctors did was to tap away some of their blood. Well, that seems a bit silly, because if you're ill, you don't want to lose the vital fluid. But the reasoning was the bad humors, the humors that make you ill, are transported by the blood. So if we take away some of the blood, the bad humors, the humors that are making you ill, will disappear. Which was probably fairly counterproductive, but still, what I want to show is that bloodletting was a regular practice well into the 19th century. So the disappearance of the theory of humors was only very slow. The full picture, let's say the late medieval picture of the theory of humors, the whole system looks like this. So you get the four basic fluids: phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood. And yellow bile, that's choler, right? That's what gives you the choleric temperament. Those are the four humors. They have their own characteristics. You get like a featural description: cold and moist, cold and dry, warm and moist. They're related to a specific element: water, earth, fire, and air. And I think, again, this is to the extent that my knowledge of Chinese culture is correct, but as far as I know, in the traditional systems here, you don't have 4 elements, but 5. And they overlap to some extent. Water, earth, and fire are there, but then you have metal and wood in the traditional system here. And then also the relation to the emotions is somewhat different from what you get in the theory of humors. Which, of course, is already an indication that there might be something originally similar in the whole system, right? A whole system of equilibrium, physiological equilibrium related to certain basic elements and related to certain basic emotions. But at the same time, the cultural translation of that original intuition, if you wish, is different. So already if we compare this system, this Western system, to what you find in Chinese culture, you can see that it's culturally specific. Just think of the basic idea: 4 elements or 5 elements. Okay, that's different. So there is certainly something to investigate from a cultural, historical point of view if we look at these things. Okay, so to go, I'm not going to go through the whole table, but the most important things. So you have the element, let's say the natural element, then you have the temperaments, the psychological part of the theory, where you have a phlegmatic character, a melancholic character, a choleric character, and a sanguine character. And then you have the physiological basis, in the sense that the humors are produced in specific organs: phlegm in the brain and the bladder, black bile in the spleen, yellow bile in the liver or the stomach, and blood, well, that's related to the heart. And then you get the further rather more symbolical extrapolation of the theory, where you get to colors and tastes and so on, seasons, winds, and interestingly also the planets. Why is that interesting? Well, that leads to another aspect of the original theory, namely that there is a cosmological influence on your temperament. That leads you to astrology. When you are born in a certain sign, or under a certain sign, let's say, or with a certain constellation of the planets, that influences your temperament. Right? So you get, and again, that's something that you also find in traditional Chinese culture, this correspondence between macro-cosmological and then more micro-level phenomena. So this is the theory of humus. And the first step in my argument now is that if you see this, and if you see then these expressions that you still have in English, then you can with certainty establish that there has been an influence of the theory of humus on emotion vocabulary. Okay? We saw that in the Shakespeare quote, but we can see that as well when we look at expressions like these. This is taken from Roget's Thesaurus, right? This is taken from a dictionary, and in the dictionary you find expressions that have this humoral background. Choler for anger, gall for anger, rouse one's choler, stir one's bile, choleric, splenetic for ill-tempered, and so on. All of these expressions relate to the theory of humus. So we have clear evidence that the theory of humus has influenced emotion vocabulary in a language like English, and not just in a language like English. I have a few extra examples here from French and Dutch, like French mélancolie, well, that's like English melancholy, colère, a basic term for anger in French, colère, well, that's like choleric, choler. And let me give you an interesting one from Dutch dialects specifically. It's not a standard term. When you have a cold, you know, when your nose drops, so to speak, that's called in the Dutch dialects a valling, a falling. It's the same term as in English. It's something that falls. It's a precipitation. But what falls? Well, it's the phlegm. It's this fluid that is produced somewhere in the brain, and that, in a sense, falls down, that comes out through the nose. That's the cold. And if you were to ask people now why a cold is called a valling in these dialects, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't even recognize the term as being related to the verb to fall. But if you think of this background, you can recognize the original motivation. So we have very good evidence that there has been an influence of the humoral theory on the emotion vocabulary, and we can also see now that anger is the heat of a fluid metaphor fits this humoral pattern fairly seamlessly, because you have this relation of anger with fire in the humoral system of things, and the fluid, of course, in this case would be the humours themselves, or at least the choleric humour. So it would seem to be historical, culturally specific, or the metaphor would seem to be historically and culturally specific relic rather than a universal metaphor. So this type of thing makes you doubt about this type of historical research. That's a methodologically very important point that I want to make. This type of historical research makes you doubt about physiological universalist explanations that are perhaps too easy to posit. Don't immediately say that something is universal because it has a universal physiologically embodied basis. That need not be the case. You have to do the cultural, historical research to establish what the exact origin of the terms is. Okay? So that's a first major step, but that's still only the background. Because there's another thing to, once we get here, we can come to the central question now. Oh, I think I'll have to hurry up a bit. We can come to the central question, which is, now where does or the central part of the case study at least, where does the word emotion come from? So given that we've been able to establish that so many specific emotion expressions involve the theory of humors, could it be that the word emotion itself also has humoral origins? So what I'm going to do now is to present part of the materials that were collected by one of our PhD students in Deufen, Annelies Blum. She worked under the supervision of myself and my colleague Michel Gooyens, who's a specialist of the history of French. And as I already said, we'll be focusing on the verbs. And what Annelies Blum, the PhD student, did was to look very broadly at the history of the two verbs, mouvoir and émouvoir, in Old French, and specifically also in Middle French. She's specifically studied the works of Évrard de Conti, who was one of the, no, who was not one, who was the doctor, the private doctor, if you wish, of one of the French kings in that period. And he was a very learned man who knew all the history of medicine and who translated Aristotle, in fact, into French. Yeah, these are the two works that from which a number of quotations will come, but that's not so important. So the steps to take are the following. First, I will show, so that's the semasiological part, I will show that the psychological reading of émouvoir derives from the literal reading, not by a metaphorical jump, but through humoral bridging contexts. To explain, why do I say, or what do I mean by the psychological reading and the literal reading of émouvoir? So émouvoir is composed of the verb mouvoir, which is to move, and the prefix "e", which is basically a prefix expressing direction, well, out of. It's like Latin ex, right? It's out of. Émouvoir in contemporary French means to cause emotion. It's the same as the English move, to move someone, to be moved by something psychologically. But in French, in contemporary French, you can only express that by using émouvoir. In French, in English, you can use move. So in English, you have to move to bring into emotion, and then the noun emotion. Right? In French, you have émouvoir, which means to bring into emotion, and then mouvoir, the original basis, only means to move in the literal sense, to walk, to have a spatial, to have a change of spatial position. However, if we look at older French, we can see that émouvoir and mouvoir both have the literal interpretation and the psychological interpretation. So the specialization between the two verbs that you find in contemporary French must have evolved at one point. And at the same time, the question is, if we look at the two verbs, where does the psychological reading come from? Given that originally both mouvoir and émouvoir have a literal spatial interpretation and both have a psychological interpretation, how does the psychological reading emerge? What is the history of the verb, the semaziological history of those verbs that brings us to the psychological reading? And then the second question is, given that they are now separate in meaning, how does the onomasiological split between them occur? Why, maybe not why, but how does the specialization occur? But the second question is not so important for the main story. I will briefly say something about it. The crucial point here, of course, is where does this psychological reading come from if we have these two verbs that originally mean spatial movement? Okay? How can we go from spatial movement to psychological emotion? Is that a metaphorical link, or is that, as I will claim, a link that is already in that, or not already, is that a change that is based in the theory of humors? Okay. So let me first show to you that in, at least in Middle French, the psychological readings of émouvoir already exist. Okay, I assume that your knowledge of Old French is about as extensive as my knowledge of Chinese, so we can't assume a lot here. So let me translate this. And by the way, reading and certainly pronouncing Old French in itself is a difficulty, because we know that Old French was still very, was not yet extremely standardized, so you get different dialects. So if I were to read this to you, it would be in a combination of modern French and some spelling pronunciations. So let's not do that, but let's just go for a translation. And the translation of this quotation is, "But, says he, anger is not without cause, and it is not so that reason commands that one becomes angry. But anger makes the injury explicit." So if you've been hurt by someone, let's say, anger makes the injury explicit and softens it. This, the wrong you have suffered, makes the heart move towards a state of anger. So what you get here in the last part of the quotation is, "C'est la cause qui le courage fait haïr émouvoir." It is it's the cause that makes the courage, in this case that's the heart, that makes the heart émouvoir, move, change, if you wish, to a state of anger, ire in this case, which you also have as alone in older English as ire. Okay, so what you get in this case is a set of abstract causes and abstract results. But there is a physiological frame, so there is a cause for the anger. Someone has hurt you. And there is a result, psychological result, anger, but it is placed in a physiological background. So we have the anger reading, the psychological reading in Older French, and the question is, where does it come from? Well, we have the two scenarios, but I've explained those, so let me not dwell on that here. Let me rather show you how we get bridging contexts between the spatial reading and the psychological reading. Now, what is a bridging context? Well, a bridging context in this case will be one in which we find a reference. I mean, you can see how this is. You can almost predict how I will argue. I have my spatial reading of mouvoir or émouvoir. I have the theory of humors, and I want to get a psychological result. So what should I show? I should show that the theory, the psychological result occurs when the humors are set in motion, literally set in motion, when bodily fluids are transported through the body. That will be the literal interpretation of emotion. Right? bodily fluids set in motion, literal motion. And the result of that is a psychological state. So the bridging contexts will be quotations where we find the two interpretations together, where we can say, here you have a reference to literal transportation of fluids in the body, and at the same time, psychological interpretation is mentioned. Okay, I guess that logic is quite clear. Okay, so let's just see if we find quotations like that. A first one is purely spatial movement and not connected with the body. Why is it that waves that are stirred up in vast and deep waters come to a halt and quiet down much later than those that are brought into movement in small and undeep waters? Well, or in other words, why do you have bigger waves in the sea than in a pond? Okay, that's the question here. But the term here, ému, that's the past participle of émouvoir. So this is purely spatial material movement. No problem. Then, next one. That is why we have to know that in spring, when the body is too full and the life spirit cannot easily get rid of them, that is to say, of the melancholic humours, in the literal sense, referring to fluids, because of its warmth and humidity, it stirs them up, and this is often the cause of several illnesses. And that is why Hippocrates also says that in spring, the melancholies are in movement. Okay? Melancholy, the melancholic fluids, are in movement literally. The heat of spring, the warmth of spring, sets the fluids in motion, literally. No specific mention of a psychological reading yet, but we do have this physiological idea. So we go from, if you wish, from spatial movement in the outside world to spatial movement of fluids in the body. These are a few additions and nuances on the physiological movement, but they're not so important. So let me skip them. Well, I'm not going to skip this one because this is interesting, because what you also get is movement not just of fluids as such, but also of what they call spirits. And what is spirit literally? Spirit is the evaporated fluid. Right? It's the gas, if you wish, that you get when you heat the fluid. So here, for instance, it says, the multiplication of spirits that, as a result of the aforementioned heat, start to move and come together. So it's not just physiologically, it's not just fluids as such, it's also things related to fluids, like the evaporation from the fluids. And also you get metonymical quotations where the reference is not to the fluids themselves, but to the organs that contain or produce the fluids, that produce the physiological substances. As in this case, the natural warmth that, in case of fear, moves from the outer and superficial parts of the body and withdraws inwards and from the top downwards, works in the same way and makes the belly and urine move. So urine, that's the physiological fluid, but it makes the belly move. Well, that's a metonymical expression for the location, according to them, of the fluids. And now, a quotation in which we find a combination of a psychological and a physiological interpretation. Okay, let me read this in French. Ire donc est une passion de l'âme qui émeut et incline le courage humain à désirer vengeance de aucune injure faite. La naturelle chaleur et ire se retrait et assemble de les ordonnances de nature comme tout entoure le cœur, et pour ce est aussi que ire est une manière d'ébullition de sang chaud entoure le cœur pour le désir de la vengeance. So, anger is a passion of the soul, une passion de l'âme, a passion of the soul that moves and directs the human heart to wish vengeance. Okay, that's psychological. The human heart is moved towards vengeance. That's a psychological thing. To wish vengeance from whatever wrong that has been done. The natural warmth of anger withdraws and comes together around the heart in a natural way. And that's physiological. So you get the heart is moved towards vengeance, a wish for vengeance, psychological. And immediately after that, the warmth of anger withdraws, comes together around the heart. That's physiological. And so that is why it is also said that anger is a form of boiling of the blood around the heart due to the desire for vengeance. Again, the two together. And again, see how beautifully this fits in with anger is the heat of a fluid in a container. But it's physiological, and it's physiological in a medical sense. It refers to the theory of humus. So we have our bridging context here, and then, okay, wait a minute. Yeah. So, what we can conclude from the semasiological analysis of émouvoir is that we find in this verb, the verb that is now in contemporary French related, associated with a psychological reading only, what we find is a polysemy, a historical polysemy, that consists of spatial readings, psychological readings, and then bridging contexts that bring together the two. And the bridging contexts refer to the theory of humus. So to cause a link between the literal movement of concrete physiological substances and psychological event is explicitly explained in the texts. It's explained in terms of this humoral theory. So, for older French, emotion is an effect of physiological movement, literal movement of physiological fluids. This is just a summary of the semasiological analysis, right? This is a summary where you see that we can go from an original literal meaning through a process of specialization to a literal physiological interpretation of literal movement of the fluids, and then through a metonymical link from cause to effect to the psychological reading where you have the emotive effects. So, what we've established now is the first step in this argument, namely that the psychological reading of émouvoir derives from the literal one, not by a metaphorical jump, but through humoral bridging contexts. Okay? Now, there's a second step to take, but as I said, I won't say too much about that. That is the onomasiological step where you have the question, okay, but then how does the current specialization of the verbs that you find in contemporary French, how does that occur? Originally, by the way, I didn't show that to you, but the type of semasiological analysis that I did for émouvoir, where I showed that you have both spatial readings and psychological readings and then bridging context, you can do exactly the same thing for the verb mouvoir alone. So if you look at the verb mouvoir alone, you get exactly the same polysemy with exactly the same kind of context. So that's the same. And then, again, the question is, where does the current specialization come from, where you have émouvoir in present-day French only for psychological interpretations and mouvoir only for the literal interpretations? Well, I can show you how the process occurs in a gradual step. I can't say a lot about the reasons for that specialization. These could be very general reasons in the sense that, at least some people have claimed that too much synonymy in the language is disfavored, that if you have really strict synonymy, there will be a general tendency to avoid the synonymy. So that could lead to specialization. That's a very interesting hypothesis, but I'm not so sure whether it is generally correct. So I won't go into those very deep reasons. What I just want to show is that we can indeed see the process happening. If we look at the further evolution of these two verbs after the Old French and Middle French period, we can actually trace the specialization process. Yeah, so as I already mentioned, mouvoir exhibits the same polysemy as émouvoir. And I could briefly give you a few quotations. Spatial readings for mouvoir. So we see that the sea, ocean, obeys the moon and flows and reflows twice during the day and during the night. And in many other ways does it move and be restless. Then physiological reasons, or readings, sorry. That is why the passions and the different states of the soul cause the natural warmth and the spirits to change and move in different ways. Combined readings of psychological and physiological senses. Anger is one of the passions of the soul and a form of inflammation and boiling of warm blood and spirits around the heart. And that is why in this passion warmth moves out of the body in an impetuous way. This is almost the same quotation as the one we had with émouvoir, only in this case it's mouvoir. So again you see same polysemy. And the purely psychological ones. Hence the jurors seeing the accused in such a depressed, subdued and humiliated state in view of the prosecutor. This is describing a trial, right? Are moved by pity and act favorably towards him. To be moved by pity, that is purely psychological. Okay, so now the history of the specialization. What we need is the following. I have these abbreviations for 4 meanings: spatial meaning, physiological meaning, combined with the bridging context. So if it's literal humoral movement together with psychological interpretations, I will bring that together in one group. Then we have the purely emotional readings. And then there are a few other interpretations that I didn't present, but that we do find in the material. So we have 4 classes. And then we have 4 points in time. Old French, Ancien Français, Middle French, Moyen Français, the Renaissance, and Classical French. So the materials I'm showing go from the oldest attestations of French, let's say around 1000, to the year 1000 maybe, up to Classical French. Not, contemporary French as such is not included, but we know in contemporary French that the split between the two, the separation between the two verbs is almost complete. These are the data that we found. So for each of the 4 categories, the 4 semantic classes, and for each of the 4 periods, you get the number of cases of mouvoir and the number of cases of émouvoir. But to make it more intuitively clear, I'm using these mosaic plots where you can see. So this is the plot that, how do you want to read this? That's the point. Okay. The left-hand block gives you the material for émouvoir. The right-hand block gives you the material for mouvoir. Then the colors indicate the various readings that you get. So the blue color is the spatial reading. The light blue color is the physiological reading. The green color is the emotional reading. And the yellow color, those are the other senses that I did not discuss. Okay. Then the third dimension in the plot is, of course, time. So within each of the 2 blocks, you get 4 smaller columns. The first one is Ancien Français, so the older period, then Moyen Français, Middle French, Renaissance French, and Classical French. And what you see in the plot is that the proportion, the surface occupied by these various cells, if you wish, is a reflection of the frequency with which we find the cell in question in this table. So for instance, to give you an idea, if you look along the horizontal dimension in the both in the left-hand block and the right-hand block, you will see that we don't have quite a lot of material for Old French. So the first column to the left is much narrower than the second column. The second column is the one for Middle French, and that's why. And why is that? Well, there is less material for Old French, and specifically also the PhD student who did this focused to a large extent on Middle French. So that frequency difference, that difference between the narrow band and the more broad band, that's not so important. We know that that is a reflection of the available materials. But there are other differences that are quite interesting because they tell us something about the distribution of the meanings. And that's if you look along the vertical dimension. If you look along the vertical dimension for each period, you can see that. And what we know about, or what we want to see about émouvoir, is that the importance of the spatial reading diminishes. And by contrast, that the proportion occupied by the green reading, the emotional one, will grow. Why can we expect that? Well, we can expect that because we know that in contemporary French, émouvoir is basically only the green reading. Okay? And of course, it's exactly what you see. You can see that green, so in the left-hand block, green is rather insignificant in the, well, not insignificant, but is not dominant in the leftmost column. But if you go on in the émouvoir block and you go to the rightmost column, what you can see is that green becomes dominant and blue becomes marginal. On the other hand, if you take the right-hand block for the verb mouvoir, what you can see is that the spatial reading, the blue one, is basically dominant all the time. So here you see how the specialization occurs, and it's a specialization that takes place through a change in the verb émouvoir specifically. In the verb mouvoir, nothing much changes. You can also transform this representation into another one. This one here, I've ordered things a bit differently. Here you get basically four smaller blocks for each period in time. And for each period in time, I've contrasted émouvoir and mouvoir. And what you see if you compare the two leftmost columns with the two rightmost columns, in ancient French, in the oldest French that we have, the distribution of the two verbs over the blue reading is roughly the same. If you take the green reading, the psychological one, then émouvoir is already more dominant or more prominent than mouvoir. On the other hand, if you take classical French to the right, you can see that in classical French, mouvoir is totally dominant for the blue reading, and conversely, for the green reading, it's émouvoir that is totally dominant. So in this case, you get this graphical representation of the stages in the specialization processes. Again, I repeat, the specialization process is not the most important thing that we want to think about here. The most important thing is that we could see that the emotive readings, the psychological readings, actually derive from a literal reference to movement of fluids in the body. So there are some further questions, specific questions about émouvoir. Why is it émouvoir that specializes? What is the relation between émouvoir, the verb, and the noun émotion, and then the loan to English. But those are questions that we need not address here, so let me go on to the conclusions. The first conclusion is, and I keep repeating that, the concept of, there is certainly a concept of embodiment involved in émouvoir and émotion, but it's a directly physiological one. It's a literal physiological one. And it doesn't have the type of universal background that is assumed by Covicius, for instance. So it has a physiological background in a long-standing scientific tradition, humoral theory, and the type of embodiment that you get here then is a universal physiological, is not rather a universal physiological one, but a culturally specific one. It further follows that contemporary French émouvoir and mouvoir, and probably their cognates in English, if they are felt as figurative at all, there would be figurative through a process of deliteralization. Remember what I introduced as deliteralization? There would be figurative through a process of deliteralization because like in the whalefish case, we no longer believe in, or we no longer have access to, the original literal scientific theory that motivated the expression. So we are reinterpreting the expressions because the original literal basis of the expression is lost on us, which is something different from what we usually consider metaphor to be. So we can distinguish between different types of metaphor. Metaphor as, let's call it, figuration, versus metaphor as deliteralization. Figuration, thinking up something that, or trying to find a model for something that you don't understand in the world, versus deliteralization as thinking up a motivation for an expression that you don't understand. An expression whose motivation is unclear to you. To make the distinction between the two processes a bit more clear, take this this graph, this picture. You get the verb to move, and okay, we know that it has a physical interpretation. That's a literal interpretation of the move to change position, or to make change position, to cause to make change position. That's what we have. So when we normally think of metaphor, we would say we have an existing reading for to move, and there is something that we want to categorize, a certain feeling, and we want to categorize that feeling. How can we do that? Well, we take the model that we find in the existing verb, and then we say, okay, we can categorize this feeling as in some way, to put it simplistically, similar to this physical material motion. And then we get a feeling as inner turmoil. That's the normal process of metaphorical use as figuration, right? Finding a figurative construal for a certain event, a certain object or whatever, a figurative interpretation given a certain existing model. So let me get back. This is the initial situation, something that needs a category, the blank circle, something that needs a category, and you pick up a category that you then use figuratively. Okay? That's the normal process of metaphor. The metaphor the metaphorical process that I introduced here is of a different kind. That's the process where you start with this configuration. There already is a link in the language between the feeling and the word to move, only we don't know why the link is there. And then we reinterpret the link. I mean, now we know that the link is there as a historical relic. That's what we've investigated. But the ordinary language user would not know. So if you want to make sense of that link, you get a metaphorical reinterpretation in this way. So those are two different processes of metaphorical construal, and of course, specifically for the line of reasoning that we're developing in this set of lectures. It's culturally and historically specific. The language that we have consists to some extent of sediments, if you wish, from different historical periods. What we encounter in our present-day language is the result of historical evolution, and a historical evolution that is culturally specific. And that also means that the categorizations that we find in the language are determined by that history. So if you think a bit more broadly, or if you look more broadly at some major steps in the evolution of metaphor studies in cognitive linguistics, then you can see that there are some shifts going on. You can see a shift from, well, a slight shift that's not so theoretically drastic, but you get a shift from from a focus on the experiential basis of metaphor and embodiment to what is now called situated embodiment. Situated embodiment in the sense that we begin to realize more and more that there are cultural differences in our experiences, and that those cultural differences clearly have an influence on language and categorization in language. But my point now is also that when we take that step, when we go along with that shift from a more universalist interpretation of embodiment and experience to a culturally specific and a culturally situated interpretation of embodiment, then there is a further step to be taken, namely that if metaphor is a cultural phenomenon, then we also need to study the cultural and linguistic history of metaphors. So if you accept that metaphors may not only express thought, but may also shape thought, then we do need to study how language is historically transmitted. Or in other words, I don't think there can be a valid cognitive linguistics, certainly not a valid cognitive sociolinguistics, without a fair amount of historical linguistics. That's the bottom line for this lecture. Thank you.